A millionaire discovered two siblings standing outside his home, desperate for help. What he uncovered about their situation left him heartbroken. The storm came in heavy bursts that rattled the windows of Harrington Manor, sending sheets of rain cascading down the tall glass panes. Inside, Edward Harrington sat alone in his study, the flicker of the fireplace reflecting off the dark mahogany of his desk. The sound of thunder rolled in the distance, but he barely registered it. His world was a curated silence, the kind that came with a life lived in grand isolation. A glass of untouched scotch sat to his right as he leafed through yet another stack of documents. A letter from a non-profit that wanted his fortune for causes they believed noble. Edward, with his sharp suit and even sharper outlook, had read enough similar requests to spot their insincerity. His eyes moved down the page, but his thoughts drifted, far from the noise of the storm or the hum of his responsibilities. Then came the knock. At first, Edward thought it was the wind playing tricks. The soft, hesitant sound barely cut through the drumming of rain against the roof. He frowned, pausing mid-sentence. When the knock came again, more insistent this time, he set the papers aside, his irritation flaring. No one came to Harrington Manor uninvited, especially at this hour. His staff, retired to their quarters, knew better than to interrupt him after sundown. He stood, the creak of the leather chair echoing through the room, and made his way to the grand foyer. The storm seemed louder here, the old beams of the house groaning under its force. Another knock, followed by silence. Edward hesitated, his hand resting on the cold brass handle of the door. The last time he'd opened it late at night, it had been an unwelcome reporter trying to dig into his past. That had ended swiftly and unpleasantly for the reporter. He pulled the door open with a sharp motion. Two figures stood on the porch, rain dripping from their soaked forms onto the polished stone steps. A girl, her dark hair plastered to her face, stared up at him with wide, wary eyes. She couldn't have been more than 15. Beside her, a boy huddled close, no older than 8, clutching the hem of her jacket as though letting go would leave him adrift. "Please," the girl said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We need help." Edward stood frozen, taking in the sight. Their clothes hung limp on their bodies, too thin for the biting cold of the storm. The girl's arms wrapped tightly around the boy's shoulders, her posture protective and rigid. She wasn't pleading, not entirely. There was strength in her voice, even as it trembled. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They were hollow, yet fierce, like someone who had seen too much and come too far to back down now. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, his voice cutting through the night. "This is private property." The girl straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "We wouldn't be here if we had anywhere else to go." It wasn't an answer, and Edward's instincts told him to send them away. He wasn't the sort of man who involved himself in other people's problems, especially not ones that came unannounced and dripping rainwater on his doorstep. But the boy, his sunken cheeks, the trembling in his small hands, shifted something deep in Edward's chest, something he had buried years ago. "Who are you?" Edward pressed, his voice as cold as the rain falling around them. "My name's Lila," the girl said quickly, though her eyes flickered with unease. "This is my brother, Sam. We just need somewhere to stay. Just for tonight." Edward's jaw tightened. He glanced past them, toward the long driveway shrouded in darkness and rain. No car, no sign of anyone else. They were alone. For all his reservations, he couldn't ignore the raw desperation in their faces. "Come in before you catch pneumonia," he said finally, stepping aside. Lila hesitated, her grip on Sam tightening. The boy glanced up at her, waiting for her approval. She gave him a slight nod, and they stepped inside, dripping water onto the pristine marble of the foyer. Edward closed the door behind them, locking it with a firm click that echoed through the vast, silent space. "Wait here," he ordered, leaving them under the dim light of the chandelier as he disappeared down the hallway. When he returned, he held 2 towels. He handed one to Lila, who took it with a quiet thank you, and placed the other on Sam's thin shoulders. The boy murmured something under his breath that Edward couldn't quite catch, but Lila shot him a warning glance, silencing him. She dried herself quickly, her movements efficient, while Sam fumbled with the towel, his small hands clumsy from the cold. Edward leaned against the edge of the staircase, arms crossed, studying them. Up close, their appearances told a troubling story. Lila's clothes were worn, the fabric fraying at the seams, and her jeans were caked with dried mud. Sam's face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, like a frightened animal caught in the open. "Start talking," Edward said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the crackling silence. "Who are you? And why are you on my doorstep in the middle of the night?" Lila's posture stiffened, her chin lifting slightly. "I already told you. We didn't know where else to go." "That's not an explanation," Edward shot back. "Why my house? What do you want?" Her eyes darted to Sam, then back to Edward. "We just need somewhere to sleep. Just for tonight. We won't be any trouble." Edward opened his mouth to protest, to demand answers, but the boy suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "We won't break anything. Promise." Edward blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in the child's voice. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of rain pelting against the windows. His instinct screamed at him to send them away, to keep his distance, but the image of Sam, so small and trembling, stirred something he couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but only for tonight. And don't touch anything." Lila nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. "Thank you." "First door on the right upstairs," Edward continued. "There's a bathroom if you need it. And keep quiet." He watched as Lila guided Sam up the sweeping staircase, her arm around his shoulders. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the house might reject them. Edward waited until their footsteps faded before exhaling deeply. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, his mind racing. This was a mistake. He didn't know who these children were, or what kind of trouble they brought with them. But as he locked the door and turned back toward the empty expanse of the foyer, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven them here was just the beginning. Edward woke the next morning to the soft hum of rain against the windows, the storm now a steady drizzle rather than last night's chaotic downpour. The faint light of dawn seeped through the heavy curtains of his bedroom, casting long shadows across the room. For a brief moment, he forgot about the events of the previous night. The knock on his door, the soaked siblings trembling in his foyer. But as the fog of sleep lifted, their faces surfaced in his mind like uninvited guests. He groaned quietly, running a hand over his face as he sat up. What had possessed him to let them stay? He wasn't in the business of rescuing stray children or meddling in the lives of strangers. Yet, here they were, tucked away somewhere in the sprawling manor. He had no illusions about the complications their presence could bring, but curiosity, it always got the better of him, was gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Who were they, and what had driven them to his doorstep? Pulling on a robe, Edward made his way downstairs, his footsteps soft against the polished wooden floors. The manor was unusually quiet, the absence of his usual staff lending an almost eerie stillness to the air. He paused outside the guest room door where he'd sent them the night before. A faint murmur came from within, low and cautious, like the flutter of moth wings against glass. Edward hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, but decided against intruding. Instead, he went to the kitchen, where the familiar clink of dishes soothed his nerves. It was only after he'd poured himself a cup of coffee that he heard the soft patter of footsteps behind him. Lila appeared in the doorway, her damp hair now brushed back, her clothes clean but still frayed. She looked older in the daylight, not in years but in the weight she carried on her narrow shoulders. Behind her, Sam clung to her side, his wide eyes darting around the kitchen as if memorizing every detail. "I thought you'd left already," Edward said, his tone clipped as he turned to face them. "We didn't want to leave without thanking you," Lila replied, her voice steady but guarded. "And we didn't know where to go." Edward studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the table. "Sit." The siblings exchanged a glance before shuffling to the table, their movements tentative, like small animals venturing into unfamiliar territory. Lila pulled out a chair for Sam, who climbed into it quietly, his feet dangling above the floor. Edward placed 2 plates of toast and fruit in front of them, his motions brisk and practical. "You didn't answer my question last night," Edward said, leaning against the counter with his coffee in hand. "Why my house? Why not a shelter or anyone else?" Lila hesitated, her fork hovering over the plate. "We thought about it," she said finally, her voice tight. "But shelters, they ask questions. Questions we can't answer." "Why not?" Edward pressed, his eyes narrowing. Her hand tightened around the fork. "Because it's not safe. For you or for someone else?" he asked pointedly. "For us," she said firmly, her gaze flicking to Sam, who busied himself arranging pieces of fruit into patterns on his plate. "We're not running from anything illegal, if that's what you're thinking. We just need time." Edward frowned, unsatisfied with her vague response, but unwilling to push her further. Yet, he turned his attention to Sam, who was now nibbling on a slice of apple. The boy hadn't said much since arriving, but his eyes told a story all their own. There was a sadness in them, yes, but also an alertness, as if he were bracing for something unseen. "Sam," Edward said, his tone softer than before. "How old are you?" 8. The boy mumbled, not looking up. "And you two are siblings?" Edward asked, directing his question at Lila. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "Same parents." Edward caught the slight hesitation in her voice, the way her eyes flicked away for the briefest moment. He filed it away for later. "So," he said, setting his coffee down and crossing his arms, "what exactly do you plan to do now?" Lila glanced at Sam, her expression unreadable. "We'll figure it out." "That's not an answer," Edward said sharply. "You show up at my house in the middle of the night, uninvited, and now you're telling me you have no plan?" Lila bristled at his tone, her shoulders stiffening. "We didn't ask for your help. You could have sent us away. And yet, I didn't," Edward shot back, his voice growing colder. "Because I thought there might be a good reason you were here. But if you're not willing to explain yourselves, then I have no obligation to keep you under my roof." Sam flinched at the harshness of Edward's words, his small hands curling into fists on the table. Lila reached over, placing a calming hand on his arm. She looked back at Edward, her eyes hard. "We're not here to take advantage of you. We just need time to figure things out." "Time for what?" Edward asked, his patience wearing thin. Lila opened her mouth to reply but froze when Sam's voice broke the silence. "To get away from him," the boy said quietly, his words trembling. Edward's brow furrowed. "Him? Who are you talking about?" Sam looked at Lila, his eyes pleading. "Don't tell him." "Sam," Lila said softly, leaning closer to him. "It's okay." The boy shook his head, his whole body tensing. Lila sighed, turning her attention back to Edward. "It doesn't matter who," she said, her voice low. "Just know that we're not safe." "Not anywhere." Edward's eyes narrowed. "If someone's after you, you need to go to the police." "No," Lila said sharply, her voice rising. "The police can't help us." The intensity in her tone caught Edward off guard. He stared at her for a long moment, weighing his options. These weren't just runaway kids with nowhere to go. Whatever they were running from was serious. Serious enough to make them turn to a stranger for help. "You have until the end of the day," Edward said finally, his voice firm. "If you don't have a plan by then, I'll call the authorities myself." Lila's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Understood." Sam stayed silent, his small frame huddled in the chair, while Edward watched them both with a mixture of frustration and unease. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but something about their story didn't sit right. And as he left the kitchen, his thoughts were clouded by the same question that had plagued him all morning. Who was him, and why were these kids so afraid? Edward sat at the grand piano in his study later that evening, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the cool ivory keys. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than the rain. His thoughts were consumed by the 2 strangers upstairs, their guarded answers replaying in his mind like a melody he couldn't quite place. "Get away from him." Sam's trembling words echoed in Edward's memory, unsettling in their vagueness. Who was this Kim? A parent? A guardian? Someone worse? Edward had no patience for ambiguity, but it was clear the siblings weren't going to offer him any clarity willingly. The sharp creak of a floorboard startled him from his thoughts. He turned to find Sam standing in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the towering shelves of books lining the study. The boy looked unsure, his hands fidgeting at his sides, but his eyes, still wide, still watchful, were fixed on the piano. "You shouldn't be wandering around," Edward said, his tone stern but not unkind. "I couldn't sleep," Sam replied quietly, taking a hesitant step into the room. "I heard music." "There wasn't any," Edward said, his brow furrowing. "I haven't played in years." "Oh." Sam glanced at the piano again. "It's pretty." Edward studied the boy for a moment, then gestured to the bench beside him. "Come here." Sam hesitated, then padded across the room and climbed onto the bench, his small hands hovering over the keys but not touching them. "I don't know how to play," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I anymore," Edward said dryly, earning the faintest flicker of a smile from the boy. He placed his hands on the keys, playing a simple, haunting melody from memory. The notes filled the room, soft and deliberate, and Edward was surprised at how easily they came back to him. He glanced at Sam, who was watching with wide-eyed fascination. "Do you want to try?" Edward asked, stopping mid-note. Sam shook his head quickly. "No, I might mess it up." "You can't mess up something you don't know," Edward said. He moved over slightly, giving the boy more space. "Go on." After a moment of hesitation, Sam placed his hands on the keys, his fingers pressing down tentatively. The sound that came out was discordant, a jumbled mix of notes that made him cringe, but Edward didn't correct him. Instead, he watched as the boy experimented, his confidence growing with each press of a key. "You're not bad," Edward said after a while. Sam looked up at him, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Really?" Edward nodded. "Better than I was at your age." The boy's smile faded slightly, and his gaze dropped to the keys. "Do you think she's mad?" "Who?" Edward asked, though he already had a good idea. "Lila," Sam said softly. "She doesn't like when I leave her alone." "She's not mad," Edward said firmly. "Worried, maybe, but not mad." Sam nodded but didn't look convinced. Edward could see the weight on his small shoulders, the unspoken fears that made him seem far older than 8. He wondered how much of it had to do with the mysterious hit and how much of it came from Lila herself. The girl carried her own set of burdens, and Edward suspected she'd passed more than a few of them on to her brother. "Sam," Edward said carefully, "you mentioned someone last night. Someone you're trying to get away from. Can you tell me more about him?" The boy's hands froze on the keys, the soft echo of his last note lingering in the air. He didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the piano. "You don't have to," Edward added quickly. "I just want to understand." Sam looked up at him then, his small face etched with uncertainty. "He's mean." Edward waited, sensing there was more. "He yells a lot," Sam continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And he hurts people." Edward's jaw tightened. "Hurts you?" Sam didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Edward exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the edge of the piano. His suspicions were beginning to take shape, and he didn't like where they were leading. "Does Lila know you're down here?" Edward asked, changing the subject. Sam shook his head. "She fell asleep." "Then you should probably get back before she notices," Edward said gently. The boy nodded, sliding off the bench. He hesitated at the door, looking back at Edward with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. Edward watched him disappear down the hallway, his small footsteps fading into the silence. The study felt colder somehow, the warmth of their brief interaction replaced by the lingering weight of Sam's words. Edward stared at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to anger. Not at the boy, but at the world that had put him in such a position. Later that night, Edward's curiosity got the better of him. After ensuring the house was quiet, he made his way to the guest room where the siblings were staying. The door was ajar, and he peered inside, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Lila was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed with an old notebook in her lap. She was writing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. Beside her, Sam slept soundly, his small body curled into a tight ball. Edward's gaze fell on the notebook. Its worn leather cover creased from use. He couldn't see what she was writing, but the intensity in her expression told him it was important, perhaps even vital. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, startling her. Lila snapped the notebook shut, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" "Just checking on you," Edward said evenly, though his gaze lingered on the notebook. "Can't sleep?" She shrugged, pulling the notebook closer. "I'm fine." Edward stepped inside, leaning against the wall. "Sam mentioned someone," he said casually, watching her reaction. "Him." Lila's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the notebook. "He talks too much." "He didn't say much at all," Edward countered. "But it was enough." Lila glared at him, her eyes hard. "We don't need your help." "Clearly, you do," Edward said, his voice firm but calm. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, quietly, she said, "It's not safe to talk about him." "Not safe for you? Or for me?" Edward asked. "Both," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Edward studied her, the fire in her eyes now tinged with fear. He could see she was holding something back, something important, but pressing her too hard would only make her retreat further. "Get some rest," he said finally, stepping back toward the door. "We'll talk more tomorrow." Lila didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on him as he left, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. Edward closed the door behind him, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Whoever he was, one thing was clear. The siblings weren't just running, they were hiding. And whatever they were hiding from was getting closer. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of quiet Edward had always preferred. But today, that silence was uneasy. Harrington Manor was built for solitude, a fortress of order and control, and yet it now housed two mysteries he couldn't shake. Lila and Sam. The siblings hadn't stirred since Edward left them the night before, but the weight of their presence pressed against the carefully curated balance of his world. He made his way to the dining room, where the staff had prepared breakfast. A plate of scrambled eggs and toast sat waiting for him, but Edward barely touched it. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the grand staircase, expecting the siblings to emerge at any moment. When they didn't, he sighed, rising from the table and making his way to their room. He paused outside the door, his knuckles hovering an inch from the wood before finally knocking. "Come in," Lila's voice called, low and resigned. Edward pushed the door open to find her sitting on the bed, her notebook clutched protectively in her lap. Sam was perched beside her, swinging his legs idly, though he stiffened slightly when Edward entered. "Breakfast is ready," Edward said, his tone neutral. "I suggest you eat before it gets cold." Lila glanced at Sam, who looked to her for approval. She nodded, and the boy slid off the bed, darting toward Edward without a word. Edward stepped aside, watching as Sam disappeared down the hall, leaving them alone. Lila rose slowly, still holding the notebook. "We'll eat," she said, her voice clipped, "and then we'll leave." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Have you come up with a plan since last night?" Her jaw tightened. "We'll figure it out." "That's not a plan," Edward said, folding his arms. "It's wishful thinking. And if you want my help, I need more than that." She stiffened at the word help, her eyes narrowing. "We don't need your charity. Is that what you think this is?" Edward asked, his tone sharp. "Charity?" Her gaze flicked away, but she didn't respond. Edward took a step closer, his voice softening but losing none of its edge. "If you want me to turn a blind eye, I will. You can walk out that door and leave me out of whatever mess you're in. But if you stay, you'll answer my questions." "All of them?" Lila's fingers curled around the edges of the notebook, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, Edward thought she might lash out or storm past him. Instead, she surprised him. "Fine," she said, her voice low and even. "We'll talk. After breakfast." Edward nodded. "I'll hold you to that." In the dining room, the atmosphere was tense. Sam sat at the far end of the table, his small frame dwarfed by the ornate furniture. He nibbled on a piece of toast, his eyes darting nervously between Edward and Lila, who sat in stony silence. Edward ate slowly, watching them over the rim of his coffee cup. When the plates were cleared and the staff had retreated to the kitchen, Edward leaned back in his chair, fixing Lila with a steady gaze. "Start talking." Lila glanced at Sam, who shrank slightly under Edward's scrutiny. She reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his arm, before turning her attention back to Edward. "Our parents are gone," she began, her voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "They left months ago. We've been on our own ever since." Edward frowned. "Gone? Dead?" "No," she said quickly, though her tone carried little conviction. "They just left. They said they'd be back, but they never came. And you didn't report it?" Edward pressed. "To who?" Lila snapped, her defiance flaring. "The police? Social services? Do you have any idea what happens to kids like us when they get involved?" Edward didn't answer. He didn't have to. The fire in her eyes told him she'd seen enough to know the answer herself. "Then who's this him you're running from?" Edward asked after a pause. "Sam mentioned him last night." Lila hesitated, her hand tightening on Sam's arm. The boy flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Edward waited, his patience thinning but his curiosity outweighing his frustration. "Victor Tanner," Lila said finally, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "He was supposed to watch us after our parents left. But he's not a good man." Edward's frown deepened. "What do you mean?" Lila's gaze hardened. "I mean he hurts people. He's dangerous. And when he realized our parents weren't coming back, he started making plans." Edward's stomach turned at the implication, but he kept his expression neutral. "Plans? To sell Sam," Lila said flatly, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "He owes people money, and Sam was his way out." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them all. Edward glanced at Sam, who stared at his plate, his small hands gripping the edges of the table. "And you believe he'll come after you?" Edward asked, though the answer was obvious. Lila nodded. "He's been looking for us ever since we ran." Edward exhaled slowly, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just a case of neglect or abandonment. This was something far darker. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room as he processed the information. "Why come to me?" he asked finally, turning back to Lila. "Out of all the places you could have gone, why here?" "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted. "We've been moving around for weeks, staying wherever we could. But then we saw your house and it looked safe." Safe. The word hit Edward harder than he expected. He'd spent years building Harrington Manor into a fortress, not for protection but for isolation. And yet, in their eyes, it was a sanctuary. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're putting me in a difficult position," he said finally. "If Tanner's as dangerous as you say, he won't stop until he finds you. And when he does, he'll come here." Lila's expression hardened. "We didn't ask you to get involved." "No," Edward said, his voice firm. "But you came to my door. That makes it my business now." The girl stared at him, her defiance wavering. For the first time since she'd arrived, her shoulders slumped slightly, and the tension in her posture eased. She looked tired, bone-deep, soul-weary tired. "Are you going to turn us in?" she asked quietly. Edward met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. He thought of the boy at the piano, the trembling in his voice as he spoke of Tanner. He thought of Lila's hollow eyes, the way she clung to her brother like he was her only anchor. And he thought of his own childhood, the long nights spent wondering if anyone would come to save him. "No," he said finally. "I'm not turning you in." Relief flashed across Lila's face, though she quickly masked it with her usual guarded expression. "Thank you," she said softly. Edward nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of what came next. "But if you're staying, there will be rules. And you'll do as I say. Understood?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Sam looked up, a glimmer of hope breaking through his fear. Edward gave the boy a small, reassuring nod before turning back to Lila. "We'll figure this out," he said, more to himself than to them. But as he left the dining room, a new question gnawed at the edges of his mind. What kind of man was Victor Tanner, And just how far would he go to find them? Edward Harrington wasn't one to sit idly by, especially when his safety, or the safety of those under his roof, was threatened. After Lila's revelation at breakfast, the pieces of the siblings' puzzle had begun to take shape, but too many questions still lingered. Victor Tanner. The name felt like a dark cloud hanging over the manor, casting an ominous shadow that Edward couldn't ignore. In his study, Edward sat at his desk, the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows behind him. His laptop glowed faintly as he typed the name into a private database, one he rarely used but trusted for accuracy. If Victor Tanner was as dangerous as Lila claimed, he would leave a trail. Edward leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the screen as the search results populated. Dead. Evictions. A handful of arrests, though none recent. Fraud charges that had been dropped mysteriously. Edward's frown deepened as he scrolled through Tanner's file. There was nothing definitive, no smoking gun that screamed threat, but the pattern of his life painted a troubling picture. A man on the edge, desperate and resourceful. Edward's jaw tightened. Lila's fear wasn't misplaced. The door to the study creaked open, and Edward looked up to see Lila standing in the doorway. She hesitated before stepping inside, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "You're looking him up, aren't you?" she asked. Edward gestured to the screen. "I am." Lila approached cautiously, stopping a few feet from the desk. And you're right to be afraid," Edward said, leaning back in his chair. "He's not a man to be underestimated." Lila nodded, her expression grim. "I told you." Edward tapped a finger on the desk, studying her. "But there's more, isn't there? Something you haven't told me." She stiffened, her hands gripping her arms tightly. "I told you enough." "No," Edward said firmly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You told me just enough to get me to help. But if you want me to protect you and your brother, I need the full story. All of it." Lila looked away, her jaw clenching. For a moment, Edward thought she might shut down completely. But then she exhaled, a shuddering breath that carried more weight than he expected. "He wasn't supposed to be in our lives," she said finally, her voice low. "When our parents left, they said it would only be for a few weeks. They were going to work out some debts, I think. But weeks turned into months, and Tanner just showed up one day. He said our parents owed him, and until they paid, he was in charge." Edward's frown deepened. "Why didn't you call the police?" Lila let out a bitter laugh. "What would I have told them? That my parents disappeared and left me and my brother with a stranger? They'd have put us in foster care, split us up. I couldn't let that happen." "So you stayed," Edward said, his voice quieter now. She nodded. "At first, it wasn't so bad. He mostly ignored us. But then the calls started, people he owed money to. I don't know how much, but it must have been a lot. He started getting desperate, selling things, taking on shady jobs. And then," her voice broke slightly, but she pushed on. "And then he started talking about selling Sam." Edward's stomach twisted. "Why Sam?" Lila's gaze hardened. "Because he thought he could get more for a kid than a teenager. And because I wouldn't let him touch me." Edward's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to be so blunt, but her defiance, her refusal to let Tanner break her, only deepened his respect for her. He leaned forward, his tone softening. "You did the right thing by running," he said. "But you can't keep running forever." Lila's eyes flashed with anger. "You think I don't know that? I've been doing everything I can to keep Sam safe. And now you're here," Edward said, his voice steady. "You came to me because you can't do it alone anymore." Lila didn't respond, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. Edward leaned back, his mind already working through the next steps. Tanner wouldn't stop until he found them, and when he did, Edward needed to be ready. That afternoon, Edward made a call to his trusted lawyer, Cynthia Rowe, a no-nonsense woman with a razor-sharp mind. Cynthia had handled many of Edward's more delicate matters over the years. If anyone could help him navigate the legal side of this mess, it was her. "Victor Tanner," Edward said, pacing the study as Cynthia listened on the other end of the line. "I need to know everything about him. His debts, his connections, anything that might give us leverage." "I'll look into it," Cynthia said, her tone brisk. "But, Edward, If these kids are in danger, you need to consider involving the authorities. I'm not splitting them up, Edward said firmly. Cynthia paused. You're getting involved in something messy. Are you prepared for that? Edward glanced out the window, his eyes narrowing. I don't have a choice. Later that evening, Edward found himself in the kitchen, watching Sam as he helped one of the staff prepare dinner. The boy was more animated than Edward had seen him, his small hands carefully arranging vegetables on a platter. For a moment, the image was almost normal, a brief glimpse of what Sam's life should have been. You're good at that, Edward said, stepping closer. Sam looked up, a shy smile crossing his face. I like helping, Edward nodded, his expression softening. Good. Keep at it. As he turned to leave, Sam's quiet voice stopped him. Is he coming? Edward paused, his back to the boy. He didn't have to ask who Sam meant. Not if I can help it, Edward said, his voice firm. Sam seemed to relax slightly, returning to his task. Edward left the kitchen, his resolve hardening with every step. Tanner might have been a looming threat, but Edward wasn't the type to back down. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: purpose. Victor Tanner had no idea who he was dealing with. The next morning brought a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Harrington Manor. Edward stood by the expansive window in his study, staring out at the fog that clung to the grounds like a second skin. The house was silent, save for the faint creaks of its old foundation. But Edward's mind was anything but quiet. Cynthia had called late the previous night with an update. Tanner's debts were extensive, far worse than what Edward had first uncovered. Loan sharks, unpaid gambling debts, and multiple broken contracts painted a picture of a man willing to go to any lengths to survive. And if Tanner had decided Sam was his way out, there was no doubt he'd come looking for him. Edward turned from the window at the sound of hesitant footsteps approaching his study. Lila appeared in the doorway, her shoulders squared but her hands fidgeting at her sides. She had become more guarded since their talk the day before, but Edward had expected as much. Trust wasn't something she gave freely. It was earned, and even then, only in pieces. He's coming, isn't he? She asked bluntly. Edward gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. It's possible, he said. I've put measures in place to keep this house secure. If Tanner tries anything, we'll know. Lila's jaw tightened. He won't just try. He's relentless. Edward studied her, noting the flicker of fear behind her defiance. If he comes here, he won't get past me. But you need to prepare yourself, Lila. This isn't a fight you can handle alone. I've been handling it alone for months, she snapped, her voice sharp. You think I don't know what I'm up against? Edward didn't flinch at her tone. I think you've been surviving, not living. There's a difference. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Edward thought she might lash out again. Instead, she looked away, her hands balling into fists. I don't care what happens to me, she said quietly, but Sam. He deserves better than this. Edward nodded. And he'll have better. But you need to trust me. Lila didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. Edward watched as she left the room, her steps quick and deliberate. He didn't expect her to fully trust him yet, but he hoped she'd at least begin to see that he wasn't her enemy. By afternoon, the house was buzzing with activity. Edward had called in a security consultant to assess the estate, a gruff man named Walter who had handled similar situations for Edward in the past. Walter walked the perimeter with a sharp eye, pointing out vulnerabilities and ensuring the security cameras were in full working order. Your house is solid, Walter said, meeting Edward in the foyer. But if this Tanner guy is desperate enough, he'll find a way to test the limits. You'll want to be ready. I am, Edward replied firmly. Walter gave a curt nod, then left Edward to his thoughts. The house felt different now, more like a fortress than a home. And yet, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that even the strongest walls wouldn't be enough to keep the storm at bay. The siblings spent most of the day in the library, a quiet refuge tucked away at the back of the house. Sam sat cross-legged on the floor, engrossed in a picture book, while Lila hovered near the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of books she clearly didn't intend to read. Edward found them there just before dinner. He leaned against the doorway, observing the scene in silence. There was something about the way Sam's face lit up as he turned the pages, the innocence in his small frame, that tugged at something deep within Edward. It was a stark contrast to Lila, whose every movement was calculated, her guard never dropping for more than a second. "You two doing all right in here?" Edward asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Sam looked up and nodded eagerly. "This place has so many books. It's like a castle." Edward smirked. "It's been called worse." Lila didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the rows of books. "We're fine." Edward stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. "You're safe here, you know. I've made sure of that." "For now," Lila muttered under her breath. Edward's patience thinned. "For as long as it takes," he said firmly. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Lila finally turned to face him, her eyes hard. "I've heard that before." Edward met her gaze, unflinching. "Not from me." The air between them was tense, but Edward didn't look away. Eventually, Lila sighed, her posture relaxing just enough to show she wasn't ready to fight him anymore. That night, Edward's unease reached a tipping point. He stayed up late in his study, his mind racing with contingency plans. The security system was solid, but Tanner's desperation made him unpredictable. Edward couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with 2 lives depending on him. The sharp buzz of his phone jolted him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. A text from Cynthia. Tanner was spotted in town. "Be careful." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. So, it had begun. Tanner was closer than he'd anticipated, but Edward wasn't about to let the man take another step toward Lila and Sam. He stood, his movements swift and precise as he made his way through the house, double-checking locks and ensuring the security feed was active. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just the quiet expanse of the estate, bathed in moonlight. But Edward knew better than to trust appearances. As he returned to his study, a faint sound caught his attention. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a rustle, a creak, something out of place. Edward froze, his senses sharpening. The sound came again, this time from the back of the house. He moved quickly but quietly, his heart pounding as he approached the source of the noise. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the moon offering just enough light to see by. When he reached the door to the kitchen, he paused, listening. Nothing. Edward pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the room. It was empty, the only movement coming from the curtains swaying gently in the night breeze. But the window above the sink was unlocked, its latch dangling loose. His chest tightened. Someone had been here. In the morning, Edward called Walter back, his voice grim as he explained what had happened. The security expert examined the window and confirmed Edward's suspicion. Someone had tried to break in. "Tanner?" Walter asked. "Most likely," Edward replied, his jaw set. "He's testing the waters." Walter nodded. "Then it's only a matter of time before he tries again." Edward's gaze darkened. Let him come. But as he turned away, his thoughts drifted to Lila and Sam. They didn't deserve this. And if Tanner thought Edward would stand idly by while he threatened them, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Edward Harrington sat in the center of his study, the morning light casting long, angular shadows across the room. The security footage from last night played on the monitor in front of him. The grainy black and white images showed nothing more than the empty grounds of Harrington Manor, save for the faint flicker of something, or someone, just beyond the camera's field of vision near the kitchen window. Victor Tanner was close. Too close. Edward tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind churning through a series of contingencies. He couldn't afford to wait for Tanner to make his next move. For all Edward knew, Tanner might already have backup, someone watching the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. A shiver of determination coursed through him. If Tanner thought he could manipulate the situation, he had badly miscalculated. Edward was no stranger to protecting what was his. But this time, the stakes weren't monetary. It was about Lila and Sam, two lives that didn't ask for his protection but needed it desperately. The siblings were in the library again, the large windows letting in streaks of pale light. Sam was on the floor, building a small fortress out of books he'd stacked in precise rows. Lila sat nearby with her notebook open, scribbling furiously, her head bent low over the pages. The tension in her posture hadn't eased since yesterday. Edward lingered in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "Lila," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We need to talk." She looked up sharply, her pen freezing mid-sentence. "About what?" "About Tanner." Edward glanced at Sam, who had paused in his book construction to look up at him. "And about how we're going to deal with him." Sam's wide eyes darted to Lila, who closed her notebook with a sharp snap. "Sam, go to the kitchen and get something to drink," she said firmly. "But," Sam started. "Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The boy hesitated but obeyed, giving Edward one last glance before slipping out the door. Once he was gone, Lila turned back to Edward, her expression guarded. "What do you mean by deal with him?" she asked. "I mean making sure he never comes near you or your brother again," Edward replied, stepping closer. "But I need you to work with me, Lila. You can't keep shutting me out." She crossed her arms over her chest, her jaw tightening. "I've been handling this on my own for months. Why should I trust you now?" "Because you came here," Edward said simply. "You could have gone anywhere, but you didn't. That tells me you trust me more than you're willing to admit." Her eyes flickered with something, doubt, maybe, or recognition, but her defiance didn't waver. "I don't have a choice." "Then let's use that choice wisely," Edward said, his voice steady. "Tanner isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants. But he won't get past me." "And what happens when he does?" She shot back, her voice rising. "You think you can just throw money or lawyers at him and make him go away?" Edward's expression hardened. "If it comes to that, yes. But Tanner isn't as untouchable as you think. People like him thrive on fear and desperation. Take those away, and he's nothing." Lila's hands clenched at her sides. "You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me," Edward pressed. "Help me understand so I can stop him." She stared at him for a long moment, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Finally, she exhaled, the fight draining from her posture. "Tanner doesn't care about rules or consequences. He'll do whatever it takes to get what he wants, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process." Edward nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll make sure he's the one who gets hurt." That evening, Edward called Cynthia again. She listened as he explained the situation in more detail, her usual brisk tone taking on an edge of concern. "If Tanner's already testing your defenses, it's only a matter of time before he escalates," Cynthia said. "We need to move quickly." "What do you suggest?" Edward asked. "I've looked into his financials," she replied. "He's desperate, but he's also sloppy. He's left a trail of unpaid debts and angry creditors. If we can leverage that, we might be able to force him into a corner." Edward's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Start making calls. I want Tanner's life to feel as unstable as he's made theirs." "And the kids?" Cynthia asked. "What's your plan for them?" "They stay here," Edward said firmly, "until Tanner's dealt with." Cynthia hesitated. "You know that could take weeks, maybe longer." "I don't care how long it takes," Edward said, his voice low. "I'm not letting that man near them." Later that night, Edward found Sam in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over his shoulders. The boy was staring out the window, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. "You should be asleep," Edward said, stepping into the room. Sam glanced at him but didn't move. "I couldn't." Edward sat down in the armchair across from him, the silence between them stretching out like a fragile thread. Finally, Sam spoke. "Do you think he'll find us?" the boy asked, his voice small. Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "If he does, he won't get past me." Sam's eyes widened slightly. "Really? Really?" Edward said, his voice firm. "You're safe here, Sam. I promise." The boy nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Lila doesn't believe in promises." Edward tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because people always break them," Sam said softly. Edward felt a pang of guilt, but didn't let it show. "Not this one," he said. "Not while you're under my roof." Sam's lips curved into the faintest smile, and for the first time, Edward saw a glimmer of hope in the boy's eyes. It was a small victory, but one that strengthened Edward's resolve. As Edward climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. Tanner was a threat unlike any Edward had faced before, personal, unpredictable, and relentless. But Edward wasn't a man who backed down from a fight, especially not one worth fighting for. And this, he realized, was worth everything. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Harrington Manor, illuminating the polished wood floors and ornate furnishings. But Edward Harrington had no time to appreciate the serenity of his home. The past few days had turned his life into a battleground, and today felt like the culmination of it all. He sat in his study, reviewing the latest updates from Cynthia. She had come through, as always, uncovering a network of Tanner's broken promises and fraudulent dealings. More importantly, she had tracked Tanner's recent movements, confirming that he was still in town, lingering on the edges of Edward's world. Edward knew this wasn't coincidence. It was a predator circling his prey. The intercom buzzed, and the voice of his head of security broke the tense silence. "Mr. Harrington, there's someone at the gate asking for you. He says his name is Victor Tanner." Edward felt the room tilt slightly, his pulse quickening. Tanner had come, not as a thief in the night, but bold and brazen, walking right to Edward's doorstep. For a moment, Edward considered having security turn him away. But he knew this confrontation was inevitable. "I'll handle it," Edward said curtly, rising from his chair. The front gates loomed large as Edward approached, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure against the pristine grounds. Tanner stood on the other side, his wiry build wrapped in a cheap leather jacket, his face a portrait of sly cunning. There was something unhinged in his eyes, a desperation that Edward recognized immediately. This wasn't just a man down on his luck. This was someone with nothing left to lose. "You must be Harrington," Tanner drawled, his lips twisting into a smug grin. "I've heard a lot about you." "And I've heard enough about you," Edward replied, his voice cold. "State your business." Tanner leaned casually against the gate, his sharp features lighting up with mock amusement. "You've got something that belongs to me." Edward's jaw tightened. "You're mistaken. Lila and Sam don't belong to anyone." Tanner's grin faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "They're my responsibility," he snapped. "Their parents left them in my care. That makes them mine." "They're not property," Edward said evenly. "And judging by the trail of destruction you've left behind, you're hardly qualified to care for yourself, let alone 2 children. Tanner's hands curled into fists, but he forced a laugh. "You think you can just swoop in and play hero? Let me tell you something, Harrington. Those kids are worth more than you know. And I'm not leaving without them." Edward took a step closer to the gate, his eyes narrowing. "You've underestimated me, Tanner. I've seen your debts, your criminal record. I know exactly what kind of man you are. You're not taking them anywhere." For a moment, Tanner faltered, his bravado cracking under Edward's unwavering stare. But then his face twisted into a sneer. "You think you're better than me because you've got money? Because you live in this mansion and wear fancy suits? Let me tell you something, Harrington. When you've got nothing, you'll do whatever it takes to survive. And that's exactly why you'll lose," Edward said, his voice low and cutting. "Because survival is all you know. You don't understand what it means to protect, to build something worth fighting for. You've already lost, Tanner. You just don't know it yet." The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. Tanner shifted uncomfortably, his confidence slipping. Edward seized the moment. "I've already called the authorities," Edward said, his tone matter of fact. "They're on their way. And when they arrive, they'll have enough evidence to put you away for years. Your creditors, your fraud cases, your attempt to exploit those kids. It's all coming back to haunt you." Tanner's face darkened, his hands twitching as if he were considering making a run for it. But before he could move, Edward's head of security appeared, flanked by 2 additional guards. The sight of them was enough to drain what little fight Tanner had left. "This isn't over," Tanner hissed, his voice venomous. "Oh, it is," Edward replied calmly. "You just don't know it yet." Inside the manor, Lila and Sam sat in the library, their tense silence a reflection of the confrontation happening outside. Lila's fingers dug into the armrest of her chair, her knuckles white. Sam sat close to her, his wide eyes fixed on the doorway as though expecting Tanner to burst in at any moment. When Edward entered, his presence filled the room. Lila shot to her feet, her eyes searching his face for answers. "He's gone," Edward said simply, "and he won't be coming back." Lila's shoulders sagged with relief, though her expression remained wary. "How can you be sure?" "Because I made sure," Edward replied, his tone firm. "He has no leverage, no power left to threaten you. And if he tries, he'll have to go through me." Sam's small voice broke the tension. "Really?" Edward crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. "Really," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "You're safe now." Sam's lip quivered, and before Edward could react, the boy threw his arms around his neck, holding on tightly. Edward froze for a moment, unaccustomed to such gestures, but then his arms came up, steadying the boy in a protective embrace. Lila watched, her guard slipping just enough for Edward to catch a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Edward straightened, gently placing a hand on Sam's shoulder. "You're both staying here," he said firmly, "for as long as you need." Lila hesitated. "We don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Edward said. "This is your home now. Whether you believe it or not, you deserve that much." For the first time, Lila allowed herself to relax, the weight of her fight visibly lifting from her small frame. Sam stayed close to Edward, a quiet smile on his face as the tension in the room began to dissipate. That evening, Edward stood in the doorway of the music room, watching as Sam sat at the piano, his small fingers pressing the keys hesitantly. The melody was uneven, but there was a joy in it that hadn't been there before. Lila sat nearby, her notebook forgotten as she listened to her brother play. Edward crossed his arms, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, Harrington Manor didn't feel empty. It felt alive. And for the first time in a long while, Edward didn't feel alone.